that happen.
The Buddha talked about the truth of suffering.
Yeah.
What do you think he meant by suffering? And what do you Buddhists mean by suffering?
Suffering?
Yes.
Well, that's a complex question, but it doesn't mean that we could be free of that if fire burns you, it won't hurt. If you get cut, it won't hurt. It also doesn't mean that if someone you love very deeply dies, you won't feel sadness. And it doesn't mean that bad things won't happen to you anymore, you know. It doesn't mean that that you won't have your personal tragedies and catastrophes and crises. And it also certainly doesn't mean that you could avoid planes flying into the towers, you know. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do know that.
So it's all about that. The end of suffering has to do with how you relate with pain. Let's distinguish, just for semantics, the difference between, let's call pain the unavoidable, and let's call suffering what could lessen and dissolve in our lives. So if there was a sort of a basic phrase, you could say that it isn't the things that happen to us in our lives that cause us to suffer, it's how we relate to the things that happen to us that causes us to suffer. One of the things that this 8th century Indian Buddhist master Shantideva, one of the things he says about this whole thing is work with little grievances, such as the middle seat instead of the aisle seat, or your favorite restaurant being closed, or not being able to get into the movie, or whatever it is, you know. He says, there's nothing that does not grow easier through familiarity. Putting up with little cares, I'll train myself to work with great adversity. So in other words, the premise there is that if you work with feeling hot and feeling cold, you work with mosquito bites and middle seats, and at that level, notice that you're hooked and work with not escalating it.
You're hooked?
Yeah, that I'm hooked. Hooked is an interesting quality to me.
What do you mean by it?
I mean, not only has something evoked a response in me, but it's going to be difficult for me to let go. Anger is like that for sure. Prejudice is like that. Critical mindedness is like that. You don't want to let go. There's something delicious about, you know, finding fault with something. And that can be including finding fault with oneself, you know. So that's what I mean by hooked. You're sort of, because of the image of a fish and the hook, and it has this juicy worm on it, and you know the consequences aren't going to be good, but you cannot resist. It's addiction. And one of the main things we're addicted to is escalating aggression.
So you escalate the anger.
So I escalate the anger. You know, my teacher, Zigor Khanchen Rinpoche, he calls it pouring kerosene on the fire. You know, in an attempt to put it out, you pour kerosene on the fire.
I like that. I like the idea of being hooked. It's a new metaphor for me. And
the word in Tibetan is shempa, and I've been teaching a lot about it lately because when I heard this teaching from one of my main teachers, Zigor Khanchen Rinpoche, I thought this is fabulous because he says it isn't the words themselves that you're saying to yourself. It isn't the emotions. It's this charge behind them that's the shempa. It's this hooked quality, this difficult to let go. In my case, I read a book by Chodron Buddhism, and it really resonated, you know.
What resonated?
Well, I'd have to go back a little bit further. I was at a point in my life where I think it was a low point of my life. It evolved around a marriage breaking up, but
your husband came home one day and said he was having an affair.
That's right.
He wanted a divorce, right?
That's right. That's exactly.
And what did you do?
The first thing that happened, I had a sort of an epiphany, or I say in the book, I think, like a genuine spiritual experience, which happens to people at a time of shock, like car accidents and things, which was time stood still. There was a completely timeless moment where all I saw was a light and heard the sounds, and it was like the eternal moment, you know. And then the mind came back, and I picked up a stone and threw it out. You know, the mind came back and started, you know, this is what I'd say about fanning the whole thing, you know. But in any case, it took me a good year not to be over it. I wasn't over it, I'd say, for about 5 years, but a good year for the pieces to start coming back together. And in that time, I looked everywhere. Different therapies, all the different spiritual disciplines. I live in an ashram. I did, you know, weekend intensives in Scientology, which I didn't last very long in that. And
you went down the cafeteria of opportunities.
Yeah, well, I was suffering. And, you know, I guess to say what I was saying before, it was like there was a pain that was maybe unavoidable, but then I was causing myself to suffer by struggling, and what I was saying and so forth. But on the other hand, it was pretty absolute. I don't think there was any way to not suffer because the rug had been pulled out so completely. The pain was so great. And into that process, sort of near the end of the year, I happened to see this article called Working with Negativity, which was a chapter out of a book, but it was in a magazine. And I read it, and the first line is something like, there is nothing wrong with negativity. Like, because what I was feeling was fear, rage, and tremendous confusion about my rage and my hatred, and a kind of a deep, profound, unshakable groundlessness, and nothing could fill it, you know. Like, people would take me to the movies, they'd take me to nice dinners, they'd do all these things, and nothing could get the pieces back together. And that was the first thing I had read that just spoke right to what was happening, because I was thinking to myself, all this time, from day one, when he told me, from day one I thought, there's something very profound in what is happening here. There is something very profound, because all I see now, as I look out of my eyes at the world, I see that a lot of us are just running around in circles, pretending that there's ground where there actually isn't any ground. And that somehow, if we could learn to not be afraid of groundlessness, not be afraid of insecurity and uncertainty, it would be calling on an inner strength that would allow us to be open and free and loving and compassionate in any situation. But as long as we keep trying to scramble to get ground under our feet and avoid this uneasy feeling of groundlessness and insecurity and uncertainty and ambiguity or paradox, any of that, then the wars will continue, the racial prejudice will continue, the hatred against people of a different, you don't agree with their sexual preferences, you don't agree with their religion, you don't agree with their skin color, you don't agree with their whatever, you know, their politics. It will always continue, because something will keep, because you can't avoid being triggered. What triggers you can get less and less in your life, but you know, it's, if you're trying to avoid being triggered, I read something recently where someone said, that's like becoming a celibate nun like me, or monk, and then trying to get rid of all the sexually attractive people in the world in order to keep your vows. You know, it just doesn't work. You have to work on your side of it, right?
Help me to understand this meaning of groundlessness. What is that?
Well, what is groundlessness? Well, you experience it all the time. You experience it all the time, and I don't know about you personally, but generally speaking, people react against it. We experience it as unpleasant when it's insecurity. You know, you feel insecure. That's a groundless feeling. Embarrassed, like off-center, you know. When my husband told me that we were breaking up, you know, he had an affair and he wanted a divorce, that was a big groundless moment. When the planes flew into the towers